Jonathan Joestar, a kind, heroic, gentle man of culture, someone who is accustomed to the finer pursuits of life, such as subscribing to the New World Review for regular JoJo content uploaded straight into your YouTube feed. And you too could be a person of culture by doing just that. Hello and welcome to the New World Review, your source for everything anime and manga, and more specifically, welcome to JoJo 101, the series that breaks down everyone and everything within the realm of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And today we are going to begin this series by examining the progenitor of all of this madness, the OG JoJo himself, Jonathan Joestar. Jonathan Joestar is a tall and wildly stacked individual who can only truly be described with one word, that being gentleman. And this man would serve as the protagonist of part 1 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, being Phantom Blood, which took place in a classic Victorian era setting in the realm of England. Jonathan was born in 1868, the son of George and Mary Joestar, although in the case of the latter parent, Mary tragically passed away whilst Jonathan was still a baby. But more on that in a bit, because that accident would actually go on to define Jonathan's life, as well as the path of his descendants, sparking the entirety of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure as we know it. George Joestar, however, was a highly successful merchant businessman who amassed an incredible array of wealth, so much so that he was able to purchase an entire estate for his family to live on, with like a mansion and everything. And so Jonathan was effectively brought up in the realm of rich English nobility, a role in which Jonathan excelled at even as a child. Although with that said, he did hold a more mischievous side, but it was all generally in good fun, and his core aspiration to become a true gentleman always commanded the forefront of his thoughts. Other than family, two figures would occupy Jonathan's adolescence, the first of which was his best friend Danny, a particularly cheerful looking Great Dane, although their relationship did not get off to the greatest of starts, as originally Jonathan acted somewhat antagonistic towards the pooch, causing him to be fairly timid and fearful. However, one day Danny leapt into action in order to save Jonathan from drowning, and from then on, the two were inseparable. Meanwhile, our other figure of interest would be one Erina Pendleton, a childhood sweetheart of Jonathan, one whom Jonathan willingly took a beating for actually, as one day he intervened to save Erina from two bullies. Although once again that altercation did not work out too well for Jonathan, or did it? Because this was the event that would endear Erina to him, and eventually she went on to become his girlfriend. Although rather sadly, this is quite probably where the happy tale of Jonathan Joestar comes to a bit of an end. Unfortunately for the first protagonist of the series, he was also thrust into some of the most tragic of circumstances, which all came about as a result of a man named Dio Brando. And this is where we'll come back to the accident that killed Mary Joestar. On that night, another man was present named Dario Brando, and he discovered the crashed carriage of the Joestar family with the intent to loot them. However, George Joestar mistook Dario for someone trying to rescue them, and despite the fact that George would later learn that Dario was a highly unscrupulous individual to say the least, he would always retain a sense of debt in regards to Dario. Which is why after Dario's passing, George accepted Dario's son Dio into his household, which was the beginning of Jonathan's living hell. Because immediately, Dio severed two of Jonathan's foundational connections in this world by murdering Danny because he's a prick, and creating a rift between Jonathan and Erina, at which point Erina would move to India with her father. So this, combined with the fact that George was a particularly harsh father, left Jonathan in a position of utter loneliness, which would be sustained for the next 8 years of his life, always wary of Dio, but putting on a noble facade in public. That was until Jonathan discovered that Dio was intentionally poisoning a rapidly weakening George Joestar in an attempt to steal the family fortune, after which point Jonathan traveled to London in search of an antidote, which would lead to a confrontation with a street thug named Robert E.O. Speedwagon. And yes, I know it's a pretty sounding name for a thug, but there you have it. This was ye olde England after all. And this would constitute another incredibly important fated meeting in the history of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, with Speedwagon swiftly coming to realize what kind of man Jonathan was. Because by this stage, make no mistake, Jonathan was an incredibly powerful and sharp man, one who could have easily killed Speedwagon and his various minion things. However, as Jonathan's top priority in life had always been the pursuit of becoming a gentleman, this innate kindness was on full display during this conflict, prompting Speedwagon's overwhelming admiration, and for the first time in 8 years, Jonathan had won not only an ally, but a trusted friend. A trusted friend who was able to point Jonathan in the right direction and find an antidote for his father, after which point Jonathan, George, and Speedwagon decided to have Dio arrested, an act that would not go particularly well, as by this point Dio had discovered the secret behind the stone mask, an object that he used on himself, actively casting away his humanity and becoming what was essentially some sort of immortal vampire. And of course, while this event ensued, George would sacrifice himself to save Jonathan. And so this poor man lost yet another of his most paramount connections to this world. And at this point, Jonathan resolved to put an end to the monster formerly known as Dio, and I guess also now currently known as Dio. But in doing so, Jonathan made the decision to set his mansion on fire in order to secure an opportunity to defeat the monster that had plagued his life, which seemingly worked because Dio was impaled, although he would go on to survive, as he often does. But some much needed good news for Jonathan right now, as after the battle, he woke up being nursed by the love of his life, Erina Pendleton, the first time he'd seen her in 7 years, and the two were given a long-awaited opportunity to reconnect. However, this is where the story of Jonathan would take a truly bizarre turn, as he was approached by a man named Will Antonio Zeppeli, who was both the one who revealed that Dio was still alive, as well as the individual who introduced Jonathan to the art of Hamon, something that Jonathan would need to master in order to defeat Dio once and for all. Now, Zeppeli was a stranger man than Jonathan was used to encountering in his day-to-day life. However, despite that, Jonathan developed another fairly incredible bond here, and eventually came to place complete trust in Zeppeli, who acted as both a mentor and a friend. The mentor part is what we'll focus on though, because Zeppeli gave Jonathan a whole host of strange tasks to complete in his pursuit of Hamon, one of which included defeating a zombie incarnation of Jack the Ripper without spilling a glass of wine, which, in context it didn't seem that weird, but having said it out loud, I guess that is pretty bizarre. In any case, Jonathan and Zeppeli would face many challenges together, one of which would be directly squaring off against a much more powerful vampire Dio, which, and this is a trend by now, didn't go very well for them. Not very well at all. However, by this time, Jonathan was showing some pretty extreme promise in regards to his training, and he was able to invoke Hamon to defeat Bruford, a zombified 16th century knight. Interestingly enough, in the process, Bruford regained his human soul and developed a level of profound respect for Jonathan, even deciding to leave his sword to our part 1 protagonist, which led to that ever infamous luck and pluck moment. Which seems really weird if you're not familiar with 19th century English literature, which I certainly wasn't, but pluck refers to the idea of needing to succeed in this world via hardship, or various stories where a character has their inheritance or position in society stolen, causing them to work to regain it, all of which is very effectively embodied in Jonathan Joestar. But the tragedy is not quite over yet, not quite at all, as during a subsequent battle against another zombie knight named Tarkus, Zeppeli made the decision to sacrifice himself in order to save Jonathan, and in doing so, Zeppeli transferred his Hamon into the fleshy vessel that was Jonathan, providing him with the power required to defeat Tarkus. However, it came at the cost of yet another of his dear friends. But now we come down to the main event, as Jonathan strived forward in the pursuit of a final confrontation with Dio, a man who had been consistently ruining not only his life, but the lives of all of those around him. And after a heated and surprisingly calculated battle, Jonathan would prove superior to Dio, finishing him off with a Hamon-infused punch straight into Dio's vampire stomach and sent his body flying off a balcony, ideally to rest and never be seen again, but okay, we'll get to that. After this confrontation though, Jonathan's cohort made sure to destroy the stone mask so that its power could never be accessed again. I mean, unless there were, say, multiple stone masks in existence, but that would be pretty unlikely now, wouldn't it? But now getting down to business, roughly 2 weeks after Dio's defeat, Jonathan married Erina, which, look, I don't know how many of you have ever planned a wedding, but all I'll say to this couple for accomplishing that in 2 weeks is good job, guys. And to celebrate, Jonathan and Erina, now Erina Joestar, went on to board a ship to America where they planned to spend their honeymoon. And I say plan because, well, as per usual, Dio shows up to ruin everything, and given that he's just ahead this time around, Dio's plan here was to steal Jonathan's body, and in an attempt to once again end Dio once and for all again, Jonathan used Hamon to set off an explosion within the ship, intended to engulf both he and Dio, and that explosion did indeed happen. Meanwhile, Erina was able to escape at the request of Jonathan, carrying an infant in her arms and a future Joestar in her womb. And sadly, that would bring an end to the tragic, yet heroic, and truly gentlemanly life and times of Jonathan Joestar. Some more fun facts about Jonathan Joestar. To keep piling on with the tragedy, Jonathan's final efforts were not in fact a success, as Dio would go on to survive the explosion and affix his head to Jonathan's body, leading him to once again becoming the main antagonist of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure during part 3 being Stardust Crusaders. This does lead to a couple of very intriguing things regarding Jonathan though, the first of which being that during part 3, it was confirmed that Jonathan had the potential to be a stand user, with his ability being awoken by Dio, now in control of his body. This stand was never canonically named, but it does bear great resemblance to Hermit Purple, the stand wielded by Joseph Joestar, grandson of Jonathan. However, I should say that the stand is named in other materials, one of which being JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Over Heaven, which rather creatively called it Hermit Purple 2, and the George Joestar novel, where it was dubbed the passion. Speaking of George Joestar though, that would be the name of the son that Jonathan would never get to meet. However, George, in a really bizarre twist, would not be Jonathan's only biological son, as due to Dio impregnating various women, Jonathan technically has a whole host of biological children out there in the world, the most prominent of which would be Giorno Giovanna, the main protagonist of Part 5, Golden Wind, which is pretty crazy to think about because Giorno was born in 1985, which, if you are keeping score, is more than a century after Jonathan was born. According to Araki, the author of the manga, Jonathan was actually a really difficult character to design because he was deliberately attempting to create a symbol of purity and dignity rather than a fresh and intriguing character for the manga reading audience to digest. And as such, Araki had a lot of trouble writing the character because he felt quite boxed in by the very strict attributes that he had granted Jonathan. Interestingly enough, Araki and his editor had decided on Jonathan being the name of the series protagonist before they came up with the name of the series itself. And from here, Araki wanted to take advantage of alliteration, at which point they landed on the Joestar surname and then the nickname of JoJo, a combination of Jonathan and Joestar, which then became JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And finally, a truly useless fact, Jonathan Joestar appears in each and every single chapter of Phantom Blood, which actually makes him the only JoJo protagonist to appear in every single chapter of their respective part. And that pretty much does it for Jonathan Joestar. But what do you guys think? Please do let me know down in the comments below. And if you're keen for some more JoJo content, then please do feel free to check out some of my other videos, or even subscribe to the channel for regular JoJo wonder delivered straight into your YouTube feed. But for now, this has been the New World Review, and I'll see you next time.